The door didn't just close, it slammed, and the man who slammed it was her own father. "You eat more than you're worth," he said, not even turning around to look at her. "The deed's in the bag. That land's been dead for 40 years. Maybe you'll fit right in." $17. A worn piece of paper. And the sound of boots walking back inside while she stood in the cold. If that had been you, 18 years old, cast out by your own blood, with nothing but a hole in a mountain everyone called worthless, what would you have done? Because what Maribel Rowan did next, nobody in Silver Creek saw it coming. If you believe in people who refuse to stay down, subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Maribel Rowan was thrown out of her family's cabin, the sky was the color of old dishwater, gray and thin and offering nothing. She had been awake since before dawn, not because she couldn't sleep, but because some part of her already knew. The way her mother had stopped meeting her eyes at supper the night before. The way her father had gone quiet. Not his usual tired quiet, but something harder, something final. She had lain in her cot in the corner of the single room they all shared and stared at the ceiling boards and listened to the sound of her own breathing and thought, tomorrow is going to be different. She just didn't know how different. Her name was Maribel Rowan, and she was 18 years old, and she was large. That was the word she used for herself in her own head, large, because it felt more honest than the words other people used. She had been heavy since childhood, heavier still in the past few years, and in a frontier town like Silver Creek, where everything was measured by what you could haul and how fast you could move it, her size had become the whole story. People didn't see her face first. They saw her body, and they made their decision, and then they never looked any further. She had grown used to it the way you grow used to a stone in your boot. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but familiar enough that you stop expecting anything different. She pulled herself upright that morning and dressed in the dark, and came out to find her father standing at the table with his back to her. Her mother sat by the fire, hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. Her younger brothers were gone, sent outside early, Maribel realized, so they wouldn't have to watch. "Sit down," her father said without turning. She sat. He turned then, and she saw it immediately. Not cruelty exactly, but something worse. Relief. Like a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally decided to set it down. And the setting down feels good even if what he's putting down is his own daughter. "We've talked about this," he said. "Your mother and I." Maribel looked at her mother. Her mother looked at the fire. "The boys are growing," her father continued. "We can't feed everybody. It's math, Maribel. It's not personal." She almost laughed at that. It's not personal. She was sitting in the house she'd been born in, across the table from the man who'd given her his name, and he was telling her it wasn't personal. "There's land," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the table. "Your grandfather's brother left it. Nobody ever did anything with it. It's yours. The deed's in your name already. I had the clerk do it last month." Last month. He had planned this a month ago. He had stood at supper and asked her to pass the salt, and the whole time he had already decided. She picked up the deed. Her hands were steadier than she expected. "Stone Hollow," it said. 42 acres in the hill country north of town. She had heard people mention that land before. It had a reputation. Rocky, remote, nearly vertical in places. There was a cave, supposedly. Nothing else worth noting. "There's $17 in the bag by the door," her father said, "and some flour, some salt, dried beans, enough to get you started." Get her started, as if this were a gift, as if he were launching her. Maribel stood up from the table. She was taller than people expected, given her build, nearly as tall as her father. And in that moment, standing in the gray morning light with the deed in her hand, she felt something solidify inside her. Not anger, exactly. Anger was too hot. This was something cooler and harder and more durable than anger. "You're not going to say anything?" her father asked. "What would you like me to say?" He had the grace, at least, to look away. She picked up the bag by the door. Her mother still had not moved, had not spoken, had not looked at her. Maribel stood for a moment at the threshold and looked at the back of her mother's head and thought of 100 things she might say. And then she thought of none of them, because what was the point? The door was already open. She went through it. The cold hit her like a wall. Behind her, the door closed. She stood on the porch step and breathed through her nose and let the cold work through her coat and her dress and down to her skin, and she told herself, feel it, then move. She had always found it easier to manage hard things when she let herself feel them completely, quickly, and then made herself take a step. So she felt it. The full weight of what had just happened, the way it pressed down on her chest like a stone. And then she picked up her bag and she walked. Silver Creek in the early morning was already starting to wake. She could smell wood smoke and hear the distant ring of someone working a forge. The general store wouldn't open for another hour. She knew every board of every building on that main street, had walked it 10,000 times. And now she walked it with $17 in her coat and a land deed in her hand, and the understanding that she would never again walk it as someone who belonged here. She didn't go to the store right away. She went to the square first and sat on the bench near the water pump and unfolded the deed and read it slowly, word by word. She was not a fast reader, but she was a careful one, and she wanted to understand exactly what she had. 42 acres, Stone Hollow. The legal description meant little to her, but the survey notes at the bottom were more useful. Someone had written them by hand decades ago, and they mentioned a limestone cliff face on the north side, a creek that ran seasonal, and a cave opening approximately 20 feet wide and of unknown depth. A cave of unknown depth. She read that 3 times. Most people would have looked at that deed and seen nothing, a hole in a mountain on land nobody wanted. But Maribel had always had an odd habit of mind. She couldn't help asking why. Why was it worthless? Who said so? What specifically made it bad, and was that thing fixable? She had driven her schoolteacher half mad with questions like these. She had driven her father mad with them too, though he'd expressed it differently. She folded the deed and put it carefully inside her dress, against her skin, where it couldn't fall out. Then she went to the general store and waited for it to open. The merchant's name was Aldous Fitch, and he was the kind of man who had strong opinions about everything and the voice to enforce them. He was behind the counter when Maribel pushed through the door, and his eyes traveled over her the way they always did, a quick, dismissive sweep, and she watched him recalibrate his level of courtesy downward. "Miss Rowan," he said, "early morning for a visit." "I need to purchase some things," she said. She had spent the 40 minutes on that bench doing arithmetic. $17 wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough to be careless with either. She had thought about what she actually needed versus what she assumed she needed, and the list she'd arrived at was not the list most people would have made. "I'll need a good axe," she said, "a bow saw, more flour, 10 pounds if you have it, another pound of salt, and dried beans, whatever you have." Fitch stared at her. "That's a lot of heavy goods for a—" He stopped himself, but she heard the rest of the sentence in his pause. "For a what?" she said pleasantly. He cleared his throat. "Where are you headed?" "Stone Hollow." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Fitch set both hands flat on the counter and looked at her the way adults look at children who are about to do something dangerous and cannot be talked out of it. "Miss Rowan," he said, "I'm going to tell you something I would tell anyone, and I want you to hear it clearly. That land is not survivable. Not for one person, not through winter. You'd be better served buying yourself a ticket east and finding work in a city." "How much is the axe?" she said. "I'm serious, girl. People have tried—" "Aldous." She used his first name deliberately, watched his eyebrows go up. "I appreciate the advice." "How much is the axe?" he told her. She calculated. She spent $12.80 and walked out of that store with an axe, a bow saw, 10 pounds of flour, salt, and dried beans, and $4.20 remaining, and she had already decided she was going back in for hens and a sheep if she could manage it. But not today. Today she needed to see the land first. Behind her, she heard Fitch say something to the boy stocking shelves. She didn't catch all of it, but she caught enough. Poor fat girl. Be dead before Christmas. She kept walking. The road to Stone Hollow wasn't really a road. It was a suggestion. A pair of ruts through the scrub that petered out entirely about 2 miles from town and left her finding her own path up through the rocky terrain. She had never been this far north before, and the land changed character the further she climbed. It got rougher, steeper. The soil thinned and the rock pushed through it like bones through skin, and the trees grew shorter and more stubborn, gripping the hillside with roots that looked more like claws. She stopped twice to rest. The first time she stopped, she felt it intensely. The shame of having to stop, the familiar awareness of her own body as something that slowed her down, that cost her more than it cost other people to do the same work. She sat on a boulder and breathed and told herself what she always told herself. Slower is still moving. Slower still gets there. The second time she stopped, she heard water. She stood very still. Wind moved through the scrub around her, and underneath it, soft and constant, water. Not a lot of it, but water. She turned toward the sound and climbed. The cave was bigger than she expected. She stood at its opening in the afternoon light and looked into it and felt something she could not quite name. Not hope exactly, because hope felt too fragile for what she was feeling. It was more like recognition, like seeing something and knowing immediately that it mattered, even before you understood why. The opening was wide, 20 feet or so, as the survey had said, and tall enough that she could walk through without ducking. The ceiling rose inside. The walls were limestone, cool and slightly damp, and from somewhere deep within came the sound of dripping water. And then she saw it. A small spring welling up through a crack in the rock floor, running a thin, clear channel along the base of the wall before disappearing into the stone. She knelt and touched the water. It was cold and clean. She sat back on her heels and looked around the cave and started to think. Not about feelings, not about her father or her mother or Aldous Fitch and what he'd said to his shelf boy. She pushed all of that to the back of her mind and she looked at what was in front of her and she thought practically. What was here? What could be built? What the problems were and whether they were the kind of problems that could be solved or the kind that couldn't. The cave provided two things she desperately needed: shelter from wind and weather, and a natural temperature that would hold steady through the winter without burning enormous amounts of fuel. The spring provided water, which was, she knew from everything she'd ever heard about frontier survival, the thing that killed most people first. What she didn't have: walls. A door. A way to keep heat inside the cave while still being able to cook without filling her lungs with smoke. Anything to eat come spring. And the nearest source of lumber was the forest she had just walked through. She looked at her hands, thick-fingered, strong, the palms already calloused from years of household work. She looked at the axe lying beside her bag. All right, she thought, start with a tree. She felled her first tree that afternoon, and it took her twice as long as she had hoped and left her hands blistered and her shoulders aching with a deep grinding pain that she knew would be worse tomorrow. The pine came down wrong, but not the direction she'd planned, and the trunk hit the ground at an angle that sent a crack running up its length, weakening the middle section. She sat next to it in the fading light and looked at the crack and felt the particular frustration of effort that doesn't pay off the way you intended. Then she started thinking about how to use a cracked pine trunk anyway. She was still thinking about it when it got too dark to see, and she went back into the cave and ate cold beans from a tin she'd packed and wrapped herself in the blanket from her bag and lay down against the cave wall. The stone was not comfortable. The ground was hard. She could feel every pebble under the thin blanket. She lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the spring drip, and she thought about all the things that could go wrong. She let herself think them through completely, every one of them in detail, because she had found that the disasters you imagine clearly in advance are the ones you can actually plan for. The disasters that kill you are the ones you refuse to look at. It was a long list, but every item on it had a shape she could work with. She closed her eyes. By the time sleep took her, she was already building the door in her mind. She woke up the next morning to the sound of wind. Not a gentle wind, a real one. The kind that found every gap and forced its way through. She lay still for a moment, listening, and the first thing she noticed was that inside the cave she couldn't feel it. The air moved at the entrance, leaves scraped across the stone floor just inside the opening, but 6 feet in, where she had slept, the temperature held. Cold, yes. But not the biting, punishing cold that was moving through the trees outside. The cave was doing exactly what she had suspected it might do, holding a pocket of air that the wind couldn't reach. She sat up slowly. Her shoulders were worse than she'd predicted. The muscles along both sides of her neck had tightened overnight into something close to a single rigid cord, and when she tried to turn her head left, she felt a bright specific pain that made her exhale sharply through her teeth. Her hands were worse. The blisters from the axe handle had broken in the night, and the raw skin underneath had stuck to the blanket. She peeled it away carefully, which was its own kind of misery, and then she sat in the gray cave light and looked at her palms. "You're going to have to use them anyway," she told herself. "So look at something else." She drank from the spring, cupping the water in her palms and lifting it carefully, and ate a small portion of beans cold from the tin, and then she went out to look at the cracked pine she'd felled the day before. In daylight, it was less discouraging than she remembered. The crack ran about 3 feet along the middle section, but the top third and the bottom third were solid. She had been thinking about it half the night, and she'd worked out that if she cut the trunk into sections and used the good sections for the structural pieces, the corner posts, the threshold, she could use the cracked middle section for fill, stack it with mud and smaller branches to create a rough interior wall. It wasn't what a carpenter would do. But she wasn't a carpenter. She picked up the bow saw, adjusted her grip so the pressure fell away from the worst of the blisters, and started cutting. The cabin took shape over the following 3 weeks, in a way that would have looked, to any outside observer, less like construction and more like a very determined argument with the landscape. Maribel was not building what she had originally imagined. What she was building was something that kept changing based on what the land gave her and what it refused to give her, and those two categories shifted constantly. The design she finally landed on was simple, which was the only thing it could be: a single room built against the cliff face so that the cave mouth became, in effect, the back wall of the cabin. She used the cliff itself to anchor the rear structure, which meant she only needed to build 3 walls and a roof, and the cave's natural depth gave her a second interior space, cooler, darker, perfect for storage, that opened directly off the main room. It was not elegant. The walls were uneven. One corner leaned at an angle that bothered her every time she looked at it, and she spent the better part of a day trying to correct it before she accepted that it was as corrected as it was going to get. What it was, despite all that, was solid. She could feel the difference the morning she finished, chinked the last gap in the north wall, packed the cracks with a mixture of mud and pine needles and whatever dry moss she could find along the cliff base, and stepped inside and felt the air settle around her. Still cold, but still in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. She sat down on the floor and let herself feel it, just for a minute. She was not a person who stopped often, but she had learned that stopping sometimes was not the same as stopping entirely, and that ignoring what your body was telling you had a cost that showed up later, usually at the worst possible moment. So she sat, and she breathed, and she let the quiet settle. Her hands had hardened. The blisters had broken and healed and broken again, and were now somewhere in the process of becoming calluses, thicker skin, duller pain. She still woke up stiff every morning. She still spent the first quarter hour of each day working through the tightness before she could move freely, and some mornings the tightness won and she moved stiffly all day. But she was moving. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Every morning she had gotten up and moved, and every evening there was something she hadn't built before that was now built. That counted. It had to. The trip back to Silver Creek for the hens and the sheep nearly broke her. Not physically, or not only physically, it was the town itself. She had been gone 23 days, and in that time she had existed in a world that contained only herself and the land and the work. And she had begun to feel, tentatively, like a person who was managing, who was, against all reasonable expectation, doing something real. Silver Creek reminded her immediately of what she looked like to other people. She came down the main street carrying her empty supply bag, and she felt the attention settle on her the way it always had. That particular quality of public notice that isn't curiosity, so much as assessment, people clocking her body and making their instant silent calculation. She kept her face neutral and her pace steady, and she went directly to the livestock pen behind the feed store, where a man named Gus Pallister kept animals for sale. Gus was a heavy-set man himself, red-faced and deliberate, and he had always been, if not kind to Maribel, at least businesslike. He looked her over when she came through the gate and didn't make a joke of it, which she appreciated. "Miss Rowan," he said, "heard you went up to Stone Hollow." "I did." "Heard you're still up there." "I am." He looked at her for a moment. A real look, not the dismissive sweep she got from most people, but something more considering. "What do you need?" "2 hens," she said, "laying age if you have them. And a sheep, a ewe, good health, not too old." He named prices. She had $4.20 and she needed all 3 animals, and the math was not working until she remembered the cracked pine section she'd discarded. The true trash piece. the part she hadn't been able to use, and she thought about Gus's fence line, which she'd noticed was short several posts. "I can get you pine posts," she said, "cut and trimmed. How many do you need for that east fence?" He looked at the fence, then back at her. 8, maybe 10. "I'll bring 10 next time I come down. Take $1 off the sheep?" He considered this longer than was comfortable. She waited. "Deal," he said. She paid $3.80 for 2 brown hens and a ewe with a slightly chewed left ear, and she spent her last 40 cents on a small roll of twine and 2 candle stubs from the dry goods shelf outside Fitch's store. And then she had no money at all, and she still had to get 3 animals up a 2-mile goat path to a cave in the hills. Getting the sheep up the path was the worst part. The animal's name, Maribel gave her one immediately, which she knew was not practical but did it anyway, was Ruth, after the slightly battered, tenacious quality she had. Ruth did not want to climb. Ruth had opinions about climbing that she expressed at length and volume. Maribel used the twine as a lead rope and essentially negotiated with Ruth the entire way up, stopping when Ruth planted her feet, offering handfuls of dry grass she'd pulled from the roadside, speaking to the animal in a low, steady voice. "I know," she said, when Ruth stopped for the 4th time and looked at her with that flat sheep stare. "I know it's steep. It's steep for me too. But there's good shelter up there, and you'll thank me in February." Ruth did not look convinced. The hens, at least, she had thought to put in her bag with the top tied loosely shut, and they rode against her back making periodic outraged sounds that she found, in a dark way, somewhat comforting. At least they had something to say. She got home, and she noticed that evening that she had started calling it home without deciding to, after dark. She put Ruth in the rough pen she'd built against the north wall of the cabin, where the cliff overhang gave some protection, and she settled the hens in a corner of the cave interior with a ring of stones around them and some dry grass for bedding. Then she ate the last of the beans and lay down and slept before the candle burned halfway down. In the morning, she found an egg. It was small, slightly misshapen, and the shell had a rough patch on one end where it had formed unevenly. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a longer moment than was probably rational. It was one egg. It wasn't a solution to anything, but it was a thing that had not existed in the world yesterday and existed in it now because she had made a decision and carried it through, and that felt like more than just breakfast. She scrambled it with a little salt in the tin pan over the fire and ate it and thought about what to do next. The cave had been useful as shelter. Now she needed to make it do more work. She had been thinking about this since the first day, since she'd sat in the cave entrance and looked at the spring and let her mind follow the problem where it led. The cave floor was mostly bare rock, but in the deeper section, away from the entrance, there was a layer of sediment, fine dark material that had been washing in and settling for years. She scraped some up and held it to the light, worked it between her fingers. It had substance. It wasn't soil, exactly, not the rich dark soil of a garden bed, but it wasn't nothing either. She had $4.20 before she'd spent it on the animals. She had no money now. What she had was time and material and the ability to think through a problem without panicking. She started hauling soil. Not cave sediment. That was too fine, too silty. She needed real growing soil, and she'd spotted it on the walk up, a dark deposit in a low spot about a quarter-mile down the path, where water collected in the wet season and the organic material had built up. She started carrying it up in her cooking pot, one pot load at a time, and packing it into the cave's deep section in a series of low raised beds she built from flat stones stacked too high. It was absurd work. She knew how it would look if anyone could see her. A large woman trudging up a hillside with a pot of dirt, alone, talking to a sheep who didn't care. But she was not interested in how it looked. She was interested in whether it would work. The math was straightforward. The cave stayed roughly 45 degrees even in deep winter. She estimated this from the feel of it, from the way the spring didn't freeze, from the way her breath didn't mist as heavily inside as out. That wasn't warm enough to grow most vegetables quickly, but it was warm enough to grow them slowly. Root vegetables especially, turnips, carrots, beets, could manage in cool soil if they had enough light. Light was the harder problem. She couldn't solve light fully. What she could do was build a reflector, a crude one, hammered tin from a discarded bucket she'd found near the abandoned wagon road. angled at the cave entrance to push the winter sunlight as far in as possible. It wouldn't be enough. But some was different from none. She planted turnip seeds first, pushing them into the soil beds with her thumb. They were the seeds she'd thought to grab from the dried turnips in her family's root cellar before she'd left. She'd palmed them while her father's back was turned, and she'd felt guilty about it for approximately 1 day before concluding that they owed her that much at least. Then she covered the beds with a layer of pine needles for warmth, and she watered them from the spring, and she stepped back and looked at what she'd built in the deep part of the cave. The rough stone beds, the slanted tin mirror, the thin line of natural light catching it. And she felt the specific, terrifying feeling of having done something that either wouldn't work at all or would work exactly as she needed it to. There was no middle option. She wouldn't know which for weeks. She went back out to check on Ruth and found that the sheep had eaten a section of the rope pen. "Ruth," she said. Ruth looked at her. "You're eating the pen." Ruth's jaw moved steadily. The rope piece disappeared. Maribel stood there for a moment with her hands on her hips, feeling the absurdity of her situation pressed down on her from all sides. And then, despite everything, despite the raw hands and the stiff back and the cold, and the total absence of any safety net in any direction, she laughed. It came out of nowhere, a real laugh, the kind that bends you slightly at the middle, and it startled Ruth badly enough that the sheep bolted sideways and hit the cabin wall and glared at her. "All right," Maribel said, wiping her eyes. "All right. We'll build a better pen." October deepened. The nights got longer and the cold got sharper, and she began to measure the days not by sunrise and sunset, but by what she'd managed to complete before the light gave out, and what was still waiting for her when it came back. She fell into a rhythm that was brutal in its demands, and slowly, strangely, hers. She woke before light. She built up the fire, tended the animals, checked the garden beds. She worked until noon. She ate whatever there was, usually eggs, usually with flour and salt in some form, occasionally supplemented by the small game she'd started setting snares for with twisted wire she'd salvaged from the broken wagon she'd found at the edge of the property. She rested a short time after eating, not because she wanted to, but because she had learned that skipping the rest cost her more than the rest took. Then she worked again until dark. She built things in that time. A proper door, hung with leather hinges she'd cut from Ruth's original lead rope. A smoke channel, a clay and stone construction she was genuinely uncertain about until the first fire test, when the smoke traveled up and out as she'd planned, and she sat in the cabin with the fire going and no smoke in her eyes, and felt a satisfaction that was close to physical. A second pen for the hens, raised off the ground on short posts so predators couldn't reach up underneath. She'd lost 6 nights of sleep worrying about foxes before she solved that one. She also built a ladder. The cliff face above the cave had a series of natural ledges that she had been looking at since the first day, wondering. The upper ledges caught more sun than anything at ground level. She had spent a long time measuring with her eye the angle and distance before she decided that a rough ladder from young pine poles, lashed with twine in an X pattern at each rung, would hold her weight against the cliff face if she was careful. She built it in an afternoon and stood at the bottom and looked at it for a while. Then she tested it, slowly, one rung at a time, keeping her weight close to the cliff, feeling each joint before she trusted it. She got halfway up the first time before the 5th rung shifted under her and she came back down fast, heart banging, and sat on the ground for a minute. She reinforced the 5th rung. Then she went up again. At the top of the ladder, on the second widest ledge, she looked south. And for the first time since she had come to Stone Hollow, she saw Silver Creek. At this distance and height, it was just a collection of rooftops and smoke columns in the valley. Small. It looked small. She stood there longer than she meant to, and she thought about her father saying it's not personal, and her mother's back as she walked out the door, and Aldous Fitch saying, "Poor fat girl, be dead before Christmas." She let herself feel all of it, the anger and the grief and the humiliation, and then she looked at the rooftops until they were just shapes, just geometry, just a place far away where she no longer lived. She climbed back down. The first real setback came on a Tuesday in late October, though she didn't know it was Tuesday at the time because she had lost track of days. She had been keeping a rough count on a flat stone near the door, a scratch for each morning, but she had missed several and given up around day 30. She came out of the cabin to find Ruth lying down in the pen in the wrong way. Sheep lay down in ways that had meaning, a resting lie, a comfortable lie, an uncomfortable lie. And Ruth's position had the quality of the last kind. Maribel went into the pen and crouched beside her and ran her hands along the animal's side and felt the tension in the muscle, the shallow breath, the way Ruth's eyes tracked her without the usual mild resentment. Her heart dropped straight to the ground. She did not know very much about sick sheep. She knew some things, more than the average person, because she had spent time watching livestock at neighboring farms growing up, asking the questions that got her shooed away. But she did not know what was wrong with Ruth, and the nearest person who might know was 2 miles downhill in a town that had sent her away. She stayed with the animal all morning. She brought water in the cooking pot and held it where Ruth could drink, and the sheep drank a little, which Maribel decided was better than nothing. She checked for wounds, nothing obvious. She examined the pen for anything Ruth might have eaten that she shouldn't have, which was a daunting prospect given Ruth's demonstrated willingness to eat everything, but she found nothing alarming. She covered the animal with her second blanket, the one she'd been using as extra insulation on cold nights, and she sat beside her in the cold October air, and she talked to her, not about anything in particular. She talked about the cabin, about what still needed doing, about the turnips that were showing the first tentative thread of green in the cave beds, a thing she'd been too superstitious to fully celebrate until this moment, when she needed something to tell Ruth that was good. She talked about the ledge at the top of the ladder and the view south, and the way Silver Creek looked like a toy from up there. She talked until her voice got tired, and then she sat in silence and kept her hand on Ruth's side. By afternoon, Ruth was standing. By evening, she was eating. Maribel never knew what it was. She didn't know if the sheep had simply been cold, or had eaten something that upset her, or if something else entirely had happened and resolved on its own. She sat beside the pen that night and watched the animal eat dried grass in her unhurried way, and felt a relief so acute it made her chest ache. "Don't do that again," she told Ruth. Ruth's jaw moved. Her left ear, the chewed one, flicked twice. "I mean it." She went back to Silver Creek in early November. She brought the pine posts she'd promised Gus Pallister, 10 of them, cut and trimmed, which had taken her 2 days and left her right shoulder seizing badly by the end of the second. And she carried them down the hill strapped across her back in a bundle, which was, she acknowledged even at the time, one of the more punishing things she had done so far. She arrived at Gus's pen bent forward at a 10-degree angle from the weight, and set the posts down against the fence with considerably less grace than she would have liked. Gus looked at the posts. He looked at her. He didn't say anything about the angle she was standing at. "They're good posts," he said. "Yes," she said, straightening slowly. "They are." He went inside and came back with a dollar coin and 2 sweet potatoes. She had not expected the sweet potatoes, and she felt the unexpected kindness of them more sharply than she expected to, which irritated her. She thanked him and went to the store. In the store, she bought 2 more pounds of flour, a pound of salt pork, and with the last of her money, 3 things she had been thinking about for 2 weeks. A packet of carrot seeds, a packet of beet seeds, and a small ball of extra twine. At the counter, Aldous Fitch looked at her selections and did not say anything for a moment. She could feel him building toward something. "Still at it, then," he finally said. "Still at it," she agreed. "It's going to get cold," he said. It came out like a warning, but she heard the other thing underneath it. The thing he wouldn't say directly, which was something closer to surprised you're still alive. "It's already cold," she said. She held out her money. He took it, counted back her change with 2 fingers, the way he always did. Then, as she turned to go, he said, and she could tell he hadn't meant to say it, that it came out before he decided whether he wanted it to. "You doing all right up there?" She stopped, turned back, looked at him. Aldous Fitch was not a man who showed much on his face, but she saw something there, something that might have been, in a limited and grudging way, genuine concern. Or might have been morbid curiosity. She was not sure which, and she decided she didn't need to be. "I'm doing fine," she said. He nodded, once, and went back to his ledger. She walked out into the cold and stood on the porch of his store and looked at the street. The people moving through their days, the wagons, the mud, the familiar smell of the town in November. And she felt something she had not felt in Silver Creek in a long time. Not comfort, not belonging, but a kind of steadiness that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was going back to, and that those two things were entirely in her own hands. She picked up her bag and started the walk home. November brought three things. The first hard freeze, the discovery that her smoke channel had a crack she hadn't caught, and a problem with one of the hens. The crack in the smoke channel she found when she woke to a cabin that was noticeably smokier than usual. Not dangerous, not yet, but wrong enough to make her climb up on the roof with cold fingers and identify the gap where the clay had shrunk in the freeze. She repacked it with wet clay mixed with ash, which she had read somewhere worked better than plain clay, and waited for it to dry and tested it again. Better, though she knew it would need repacking in the spring when she could do a proper job. The hen problem was different. One of the brown hens, the smaller one, who had never been quite as vigorous as her companion, stopped laying. This was, in the larger scheme of the challenges she was navigating, not catastrophic. It was 1 egg per day instead of 2. But it mattered, and it worried her, not because of the egg count, but because of what it might mean about the hen's health. And losing an animal in the deep of winter when she couldn't replace it felt like a risk she couldn't afford to ignore. She spent a day watching the hen very carefully. She adjusted the bedding in the hen pen. She moved the tin reflector so more of the thin winter light reached the corner where they roosted. She increased their grain ration slightly, taking it from her own flour supply, which was a decision she made quietly and didn't dwell on, and she added some dried plant material she'd gathered in the fall, dry seed heads that she'd read encouraged foraging behavior in confined birds. 3 days later, the hen laid an egg. Maribel held it in her palm and felt, once again, that sensation of having navigated something by paying attention, by watching carefully and thinking and trying things and refusing to panic. It was not a feeling she could have put into words very easily, but it had started to feel tentatively like something she could trust. The garden beds were growing, slowly, frustratingly slowly. The turnip seedlings were thin, pale threads, nothing like the thick green growth she'd seen in summer gardens, and the carrots and beets she'd planted later hadn't yet broken soil. But the turnips were alive, and every morning she brought the tin reflector to its best angle and checked the beds and told herself that slow growth was still growth. She had begun keeping a record. She had no paper, so she was doing it on the inner wall of the cave, scratching into the soft limestone with a nail she'd pulled from a piece of salvaged wood. Little marks, little notations, days, temperatures she estimated, what the animals ate, and how much, when things changed. She was not sure the record would ever matter to anyone but herself, but the act of keeping it made her feel less like she was disappearing. The marks on the wall were also evidence, not for anyone else, for herself. Proof that things were happening, that the days had content, that the work she was doing was producing something visible, even if only she could see it. She ran her finger along the marks one evening in late November, counting back to the beginning. More than 40 days. 40 days of feeding the hens and carrying water and checking the garden beds and cutting wood and packing clay into gaps and hauling dirt and building and fixing and sleeping on the stone floor and waking up and doing it again. More than 40 days since her father had put a worn piece of paper on a table and told her it wasn't personal. She took the nail and added that night's mark to the wall. Then she went to check the garden beds, and in the deepest section of the cave, in the thin reflected winter light, she saw the first carrot seedling, a hair-thin thread of deep green pushing through the dark soil. She crouched in front of it and stayed there a long time, and the spring dripped behind her, and outside the wind picked up and moved through the pines in a sound like water, and she did not think about her family or the town or any of the things that had been done to her. She just looked at the small thread of green and thought, there it is. There's the first one. She was still crouched there when Ruth, who had apparently worked a loose board in her pen again, wandered into the cave entrance and stood looking at her with mild interest. "Don't even think about it," Maribel said. Ruth regarded the garden beds. Her jaw moved. "Ruth, I am not joking." She got up and guided the sheep back to the pen and repaired the board in the dark with her hands by feel. And by the time she was done, her fingers were numb and her knees ached from kneeling on the cold ground, and she was, in the complicated way that had become her normal, all right. She went inside. She let the fire down to coals. She lay down on her blanket on the stone floor. Outside, the wind ran hard across the mountain, and she could hear it but not feel it, and that difference between what the wind could do out there and what it could do in here was entirely her own construction. She closed her eyes and let that be enough for one night. December arrived without announcement. One morning, Maribel came out to tend the animals, and the world had simply changed overnight. The color drained out of everything. The remaining dry grass flattened under a skin of frost that crunched under her boots. The sky, the particular shade of white that meant the cold had settled in and was not leaving. She stood in the doorway of the cabin for a moment and breathed the air and felt the way it reached down into her lungs and made them work harder, and she thought, this is it. This is the season that kills people. She went and fed the hens. She had been preparing for winter in the way she prepared for everything, methodically, without allowing herself to think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead when resources were limited had a way of generating a panic that was more dangerous than the actual problem. She had a woodpile that stood nearly as tall as the cabin eave on the south side, built from everything she'd felled and split over the past 2 months. She had root vegetables growing in the cave. She had eggs, 2 a day now, the smaller hen having recovered fully, and she had Ruth, who was producing a thin but consistent amount of milk that Maribel had learned to work with, though the learning had not been graceful. She had flour and salt pork and dried beans, and the cured meat from 2 rabbits she'd snared in November and smoked over green wood, which had taken the better part of a day and produced a result that was genuinely unpleasant to look at, but would not kill her. What she did not have was any margin for things going wrong. This was the thought that lived at the back of her mind, quiet and patient, through every good day. The woodpile was enough if the winter was average. If it was worse than average, she would run out. The food was enough if she was careful, and the animals stayed healthy. If either of those things shifted, the math stopped working. She had built a system that functioned at its intended scale, but it had no slack in it, and she knew it, and the knowing was a constant low-level hum underneath everything she did. She made herself not talk to Ruth about it. Ruth didn't need to hear it, and saying it out loud made it feel more likely than it was. The cold deepened through the first week of December in a way that was measurable. She could feel it in the water from the spring, which came colder now, and in the way the ground inside the cave entrance had started to go hard, where she hadn't insulated it. She spent 2 days laying down a floor of flat stones covered with a thick layer of pine needles and ash for the cave's outer section, which helped. The inner section, where the garden beds were, stayed warmer. The spring kept the air from dropping below what the plants could tolerate, just barely, and the tin reflector brought in what light the short days offered. The turnips had thickened. She'd thinned them twice, pulling the crowded ones and eating the greens raw beside the beds, because they were there, and she was hungry, and she was not going to be precious about it. The carrots were slower, still thin-shouldered, more potential than substance. The beets were the most vigorous of the 3, dark leaves, sturdy stems, pushing up with a stubbornness she found genuinely admirable. She talked to the plants sometimes, less than she talked to Ruth, but more than she talked to herself. She was aware this was not rational behavior. She did it anyway. One morning she came into the cave to check the beds and found that something had gotten to the turnips. She stood very still, looking at the damage. 3 plants pulled entirely from the soil, root and all, gone. 4 more disturbed, leaves chewed, the soil around them dug up. She crouched and looked at the marks in the dirt beside the bed. Small, distinct, the curved impressions of claws. Mouse. Maybe 2. She straightened up and stood in the cave and went through the options. Traps. She had wire. She could make them. A cat. She didn't have one and couldn't afford to go get one. And besides, introducing a predator to a space with hens involved risks she didn't want to manage right now, blocking the access points. But the cave had so many natural crevices in the limestone that sealing all of them would take days, and she wasn't certain she could do it completely. She chose traps, and she spent that evening making 5 of them from bent wire and short sections of stick, baited with a smear of flour paste. She placed them around the beds and went to sleep with a specific kind of irritation, not the hot anger kind, but the cold, focused kind that sharpened her attention rather than scattering it. She caught 3 mice in 2 days. After that, the damage stopped. She repaired the disturbed beds, replanted the pulled turnips from the ones she'd kept as backups. She had kept backups of everything, a habit of mind she'd developed without consciously choosing it, always saving something aside in case the first version failed. And she stood back and looked at the beds and breathed and moved on. It was on a gray Thursday in mid-December that she heard voices on the path. She was on the roof at the time, repacking the smoke channel again. The clay had cracked a second time, and she had accepted that this was going to be an ongoing project through the winter, when she heard them. Two voices. Male. Getting closer. She came down from the roof in a careful hurry and stood at the cabin corner and listened. The voices resolved into words as they came up through the scrub. Told you it was a fool's errand. The path doesn't even... It's here somewhere. Deed says north face, limestone cliff. She recognized neither voice, but the second one she identified by type immediately. Someone reading from something. Someone official. Her shoulders tightened. Two men came around the stand of pine that screened the lower approach to the hollow, and they stopped when they saw her. One was a young man in a coat that was too thin for the weather, carrying a leather satchel. The other was older, heavy-set, and wearing the kind of hat that people wore when they wanted to look authoritative without having an actual authority behind them. The older man looked at her. He looked at the cabin, the rough walls, the door she'd made, the woodpile. And she watched him recalibrating. "Miss Rowan?" the younger man said. "Yes," she said. "I'm Clement Ward. I work for the county assessor's office." He opened his satchel and produced a paper. "We received a notice of occupancy for this land parcel. Stone Hollow, 42 acres. We're here for the property assessment." "All right," she said. He looked at the cabin again. He looked at the cave opening behind it, where she'd hung a second piece of oilcloth over the inner entrance for insulation. He looked at Ruth, who had appeared at the pen gate and was watching the strangers with the blank, regal attention of an animal who believes herself to be more important than she is. "You've been here how long?" the older man said. He hadn't introduced himself. "Since October," Maribel said. "Alone?" "Yes." He looked at her the way men like him usually looked at her. Or rather, he looked at her body the way men like him usually looked at it, making his assessment, and she waited for what the assessment would produce. She had gotten good at waiting for it. "That's a substantial structure," the younger man said, meaning it as a compliment, she thought, but not quite landing it. "It works," she said. They assessed. She walked with them because she was not going to stand aside and let two strangers walk through what she'd built without her present. The young man made notes. The older man did not say much, but she caught him stopping at the cave entrance, drawn, she could tell, by the unexpected warmth that came out of it even in December, and leaning in slightly. "What's in there?" he said. "Storage," she said, "and a garden." He turned and looked at her. "A garden," he said. "Underground. In December." "Yes." He looked back into the cave. She could see him deciding whether to ask more questions or leave, and she watched the decision resolve in favor of leaving, which was the right one. They went back down the path. At the bottom, the young man turned and looked back up at the hollow, at the cabin against the cliff, the smoke rising from the chimney, the rough structure of the pen, the whole unlikely establishment. And she saw on his face something that was not pity and was not the cruel amusement she was used to. It looked more like confusion, like he was trying to fit what he was seeing into a category that didn't exist. She let them go and went back up on the roof to finish the chimney. The blizzard came the third week of December, and it did not come the way storms usually came, with warning, with a change in the air that gave you time to prepare. It came fast and sideways, dropping out of the north in the space of a single afternoon. And by the time Maribel registered what was happening, the temperature had fallen 15 degrees in 2 hours, and the snow was coming horizontally. She had been in the woodpile yard when she felt the shift. The wind changed direction first, swung around to the north hard enough that she stumbled, and then the snow hit, not the gentle beginning of a storm, but the full middle of one, as though it had been waiting just over the ridge and simply arrived all at once. She moved fast. She got Ruth inside first, which involved physically pushing the sheep through the cabin door because Ruth drew the line at going inside a human building regardless of weather. She got the hens settled in the cave section, deeper in than usual, blocked the inner entrance with the oilcloth barrier, and weighted its base with stones. She brought in the last 6 pieces of wood from outside rather than the 3 she'd planned, which meant one more trip into the storm, which meant coming back in with her coat soaked through to the shoulder and her hands gone from cold to pain and then from pain to nothing. She stood at the fire and pressed her hands close to the flame and waited for the feeling to come back. And the coming back was the part she'd never gotten used to, that particular electric agony of circulation returning to cold, damaged fingers. She made a sound she wouldn't have made if there had been anyone to hear it. Ruth, inside the cabin for the first time, stood in the corner farthest from the fire and looked at everything with the extreme suspicion of an animal in an unfamiliar space. She knocked over the tin cup hanging from the wall peg within 5 minutes of arrival. "Leave it," Maribel said, without looking up from the fire. Ruth left it and knocked over the small stack of flat stones Maribel used for a rough shelf instead. Ruth. The sheep stood very still, radiating innocence. Outside, the wind was doing something she had not heard before. Not the rush and fall of normal wind, but a sustained, pressurized roar that seemed to come from every direction at once. She had built this cabin to hold against weather, but she had not built it against this. She could feel the difference. The walls held, but she could hear them, tiny sounds, the settling and adjusting of wood and stone and mud against extraordinary pressure. She did not let herself think about whether they would keep holding. She focused on what she could control. The fire at a steady, managed burn, not too high, not wasteful. The animals checked every 2 hours. The snow that was beginning to push under the door edge swept back with a stick she kept for the purpose. The food rationed mentally. She was already calculating, adjusting, figuring what could be stretched, and for how long. The storm ran through the rest of that day and all of the night. She slept in intervals, waking every 2 hours as she'd planned, moving through the checks. Second hour, fire, door seal, animals. Fourth hour, same plus a look at the cave beds. She was most worried about the cold reaching the inner cave if the storm dropped the temperature below what the spring could buffer. The beds were all right. The spring was all right. Sixth hour. Ruth had somehow moved to the exact center of the cabin floor and gone to sleep with her legs tucked under her in a way that made her look like a very large and inconvenient piece of furniture, and Maribel had to step over her to reach the fire. "You have a perfectly good pen," Maribel told her. Ruth's ear flicked. "I built it specifically so you'd have somewhere comfortable." Ruth did not open her eyes. She sat down next to the fire with her back against the wall and pulled her knees up and let the warmth work on her bones and tried to calculate how long the storm might last. She didn't have good information. She had no way of knowing. She had paid attention to weather patterns over the past 2 months, the way the sky looked before it snowed, the way animals behaved ahead of temperature changes. But this storm was outside the range of anything she'd observed. This was bigger. This was different. She was still sitting there, running through possibilities and plans, when she heard it. At first she thought it was the wind changing pitch, the storm doing something different with the eaves. She stayed still and listened. It came again, and this time she heard it clearly, pounding. Something striking the cabin door, not the storm, a hand. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. She opened the door against the pressure of the wind, bracing with her whole body, and the cold and noise hit her like a physical blow. In the storm, barely visible, a shape, a man, she realized, bent nearly double, one arm raised and falling against the doorframe. When the door opened, he fell forward, and she caught him, which was a thing she could do because she was large and he had nothing left in him. She got him inside. She got the door shut. He was on the floor. She could see him now in the firelight. Older, maybe 50, with a beard that had ice crystals in it and the gray color in his face that came when the cold had gotten into places it shouldn't. He was wearing heavy work clothes, a trapper's coat, and one of his boots had a split sole that had let the snow pack inside. She did not recognize him. Then she did. Faintly. A man she had seen twice in Silver Creek, at the edge of her attention. A trapper who kept to himself. She had heard him say something in Fitch's store once, something aimed at her direction, something that had made the shelf boy laugh. She didn't spend time on that. She got the coat off him, got the boot off. The foot inside was alarming, white at the toes in a way that needed immediate attention. And she got him as close to the fire as she safely could and wrapped her second blanket around him, the one she'd taken back from Ruth weeks ago after the sheep had recovered. "Stay awake," she told him. He was not fully conscious. His eyes opened and didn't focus. "Hey." She put her hand on the side of his face, felt the cold in his skin. "Open your eyes. Look at me." He looked at her, or toward her. His eyes were the wrong kind of blank. "What's your name?" she said. A pause. "Caleb," he managed. "Caleb Morrow." "All right, Caleb. You're inside. You're out of the storm. I need you to stay awake." He tried. She could see him trying. She boiled water on the fire, fast, no patience for slow. and made a thin broth from salt pork and a pinch of flour, the most heat-dense thing she could produce quickly, and she got some of it into him a spoonful at a time. She worked on his feet with warm cloths, slow warming, the way she'd heard you were supposed to do it. The color in his toes was her main concern. Not white anymore after 20 minutes, which was the direction she needed it to move. He came around slowly. The gray left his face by degrees and something more normal replaced it, and his eyes started to track the room rather than stare through it. And after about an hour, he was sitting up against the wall with the blanket around him and both hands wrapped around the tin cup she'd filled with broth. And he looked at her across the small space of the cabin, and she could see him processing where he was. He looked at the walls. He looked at the fire. He looked at Ruth, who had relocated to the far corner and was watching him with the focused suspicion she reserved for strangers. "You built this," he said. Wasn't a question, but it had the quality of one. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him moving through something internally, some recalibration. She waited. "I said something," he said then, without looking at her directly. "Last spring, in Fitch's store." She looked at him. "I remember it," he said. "What I said." She didn't help him along. If he needed to say something, he needed to find his own way to it. He didn't say anything more, not then. He looked at the fire. His jaw worked once, the way people's did when they were working against something difficult. And then he looked at her again and said, "I'm sorry." It was not a large apology. It didn't have flowery language in it or explanation. It was just those two words, plain, from a man who was clearly not accustomed to saying them and was saying them anyway. "All right," she said. She didn't say it's fine because it hadn't been. She didn't say I forgive you because that felt like giving him something he had the business of making things easy for people who'd been unkind to her. But all right was honest. It acknowledged what he'd said and let it sit in the room without needing anything more from either of them. He drank his broth. An hour later, when he was warm enough to be coherent and the immediate danger had moved back to a manageable distance, he told her what he'd been doing outside. He had been coming from his trap lines, he said, and the storm had come up faster than he'd expected. He'd been trying to get back to town when he'd lost the path. The snow had covered the track markers he'd set, and he'd wandered north instead of south, climbing when he should have been descending, until he'd found the cliff face and followed it and seen the light from the cabin through the storm. "Anyone else out there?" she asked. He hesitated. "Caleb." "I passed a wagon," he said, "on the lower road, maybe an hour before I found your path. Overturned. I couldn't—" He stopped. "I couldn't stop. I was already in trouble." "Who was in it?" "I don't know. I couldn't see clearly. 2 people, I thought." She was already moving. She picked up her coat, which was still damp from earlier. "Wait," he said, and something in his voice changed. Alarm, she thought, and something underneath it that was closer to shame. "You can't go back out there." "Someone's in an overturned wagon in this storm," she said. "You'll die," he said. It was not dramatic. He said it flat, like a statement of fact. "Maybe," she said. "Where on the lower road?" "Miss Rowan?" "Where, Caleb?" He looked at her for a long moment, at her face, really looked at it, the way he probably hadn't when he'd made his comment in Fitch's store, the way people didn't bother to look at her when they'd already decided what she was. And she watched something change in his expression, something slow and complicated, like a man who has been carrying one version of a story and is suddenly holding a different one. "About a mile down," he said, "maybe a 1/4 mile north of where the road curves at the big rock." She wrapped the rope she'd been using to secure the woodpile around her waist. She took the lantern, lit it, cupped the flame from the door's draft with her body. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "If I'm not back in 2 hours," she said, "bank the fire and stay put." "I should come with you," he said. But he tried to stand when he said it, and his legs didn't cooperate, and they both saw it. "Stay with the animals," she said. It was a practical thing to say, but she also meant it as something else, a thing to be responsible for, something that needed him present. She'd found that people who had a job to do stayed warmer and clearer than people who were only waiting. She opened the door and stepped back into the storm. The world outside was something she didn't have words for immediately. The wind hit her from the left and she leaned into it and started moving, keeping the cliff face on her right as a reference point, stepping carefully because the snow was deep enough now that she couldn't feel the ground beneath it, and the footing was unpredictable. The lantern helped more than she'd expected. It lit a small circle of certainty around her feet, enough to see each step, and she focused on the next step, and only the next step, and did not think about anything else. The cold was different at the depth of the storm than it was on the ordinary cold mornings she'd gotten used to. This cold had intent, was the way she would have described it if she were being irrational. It pushed through her coat in the places she'd always known it was thin, the shoulders, the left cuff where the stitching had come loose, and it found her wrists and her face and the strip of neck between her collar and her hat, and it stayed there, working. She counted steps. It was a thing she did when conditions were bad, not to measure distance, but to keep her mind from going sideways. 1, 2, 3. The path down to the lower road was something she'd walked enough times that her feet remembered it, even when her eyes couldn't find it. She trusted her feet. She made herself trust them. She found the road by finding the place where the scrub on both sides opened up. She could feel the space rather than see it, the way the wind hit her differently without the brush to break it. The snow on the road was deeper than on the path, swept in by the open space above it. She went north along the road, lantern out to her right side, and told herself not to hurry, because hurrying in these conditions was the way you fell and the way you didn't get up. She almost walked past the wagon. It was the shape of it that caught her. A dark mass that was wrong for the landscape, too geometric, too solid. She turned toward it and crossed the road, and the drift was waist-deep there, had packed against the overturned wagon bed and nearly buried it. She waded through the drift, lantern raised. 2 people. She saw them as she came around the wagon, an older woman lying in the lee of the wagon bed where someone had apparently positioned her, and a man kneeling over her, his back to the wind, his coat spread over both of them. He had given her most of what he had. He was in bad shape. She got close enough for the lantern to reach his face, and she stopped. Aldous Fitch looked up at her. He stared. She could see him trying to understand what he was seeing, who he was seeing, and she watched the understanding arrive and do something complicated to his face. She did not have time for whatever that complication was. "Can she walk?" Maribel said. His voice came out wrong too. Too thin, too slow. "She was walking earlier. I don't know." Maribel crouched down beside the woman. Mrs. Fitch, she realized. She'd seen her in the store many times. And put her hand on the woman's face. Cold, very cold, but her eyes opened. Aware, still. Alert in the particular sharp way of people who are frightened and holding on. "Mrs. Fitch," Maribel said clearly, "my name is Maribel Rowan. I have shelter up the hill. I need you to try to stand." The woman looked at her. Something moved through her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Then, "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was a wreck, barely above a whisper. "Good," Maribel said. "Then you know I'm going to need you to work with me. Can you feel your feet?" "Some." "Enough to stand?" A pause. Then the woman pushed herself up, and Maribel got under her right arm and took her weight, and felt the woman's full cold mass lean against her side, and she told her body to handle it, just handle it, because there was no alternative, and her body understood that. She looked at Fitch. "You need to stand up now," she said. He looked at her. The complicated thing was still on his face. "Miss Rowan, Aldous, stand up." He stood up. She gave him the rope end from around her waist. "Hold this and stay close," she said. "I've got her. You follow. We're going straight up the path. Don't try to go faster than I'm going." "The path's buried," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll find it." He looked at her one more time. A long look. The kind she'd never gotten from him in all her years of shopping at his counter. And then he took the rope. She turned into the storm and started climbing. She would not be able to describe it later in any way that made sense to someone who hadn't been there. It was not heroic in the way stories made things heroic. It was slow and brutally heavy, and she fell twice. Once when her left foot found nothing under the snow where she expected ground, and once when Mrs. Fitch lurched sideways against her on a steep section, and they both went down together, and Maribel had to get the woman up before she got herself up, which involved a sequence of movements she'd never attempted in her life and would never fully remember. She talked the whole way. Not to inspire anyone, not to be brave. She talked because it was the only thing that kept her mind from doing what it wanted to do, which was to make a very complete and convincing case for stopping. She talked about the cabin and the fire and the broth on the stove, and Ruth, who was probably standing in the middle of the floor again, and the beats in the cave that were doing better than she'd expected. And she said these things into the wind, and the wind took them, and she said more, and those went too, and she kept moving. The cliff face appeared in the lantern light when she had given up expecting it. The cabin door, when she pushed it open, let out a wave of warmth that hit her so sharply after the cold that her eyes filled with water that froze on her cheeks before it could fall. Caleb Morrow was on his feet, barely, leaning against the wall, but on his feet, and his face when they came through the door was one of the more honest expressions she'd ever seen on a grown man. Something stripped down, something that looked at the three of them and understood what it meant that they were there. She got the Fitches inside, she got the door closed, she got them to the fire, and then her legs, which had been working on the same kind of pure determination that runs separate from the body and doesn't file reports until it's done, stopped. She sat down on the floor next to the fire because standing was no longer an option, and she sat there in her soaked coat and her wet boots, and she breathed and she let the warmth start working on her from the outside in. Ruth, who had retreated to the far corner during all of this, came over and put her chin on Maribel's knee. "Yeah," Maribel said. Her voice came out almost nothing, just breath and shape. "I know." The fire popped. Outside, the storm ran on against the walls she had built, and the walls held, and inside the small circle of warmth there were 4 people and 1 sheep and 2 hens who were somewhere in the cave making occasional comments, and the spring dripped in the dark behind the oilcloth, and the beets grew in their beds of poor dark soil, and Maribel sat on the stone floor she had carried soil over and built walls for and slept on for more than 2 months, and for the first time since her father had put a worn deed on a table and called it a gift, she was not alone in the place she had made. She did not decide what that meant. She was too tired to decide anything. She just let it be what it was. She slept like something that had been turned off. No dreaming, no half-waking, no intervals of consciousness checking the fire or the animals the way she had been doing for weeks. Just absence, complete and total. For hours she couldn't account for when she came back to herself on the cabin floor with her coat still on, and someone else's blanket laid over her. She lay still for a moment before she opened her eyes, running inventory the way she'd learned to do. What hurt, what was functional, what needed immediate attention. Her shoulders were the worst, both of them, a deep grinding soreness that went to the bone. Her left knee had something wrong with it that she didn't remember acquiring, a hot stiffness that protested when she shifted. Her hands were intact but deeply tired in a way that was different from the blistered exhaustion of the early weeks. This was the tiredness of muscles that had been pushed past their design, that needed rest rather than just recovery. She opened her eyes. The fire was burning. Someone had tended it. She sat up slowly and looked around the cabin. Mrs. Fitch, she would learn her name was Eleanor, was asleep against the far wall, wrapped in the trapper's coat and one of Maribel's 2 blankets. Caleb Morrow was sitting near the door on the 3-legged stool Maribel used for milking Ruth, awake, his foot propped on a piece of firewood, watching the fire with the focused attention of a man who has been given a job and is taking it seriously. And Aldous Fitch was crouched at the fireplace, feeding it another piece of wood from the pile she kept stacked along the interior wall. He heard her sit up. He turned. In the firelight, without the counter of his store between them, and without the particular arrangement of authority that a shopkeeper had in his own space, Aldous Fitch looked older than she remembered him. He had a deep cut along his left cheekbone from the wagon accident. Dried blood, not serious, but the kind of mark that would leave a scar. And his coat was still damp at the shoulders, and he looked like a man who had spent the night understanding something he hadn't understood before, and the understanding had not been comfortable. "You were out for about 4 hours," he said. "The animals," she said immediately. "Fed. The hens laid while you were sleeping. The sheep—" He paused. "The sheep is in the corner." She looked. Ruth was in the corner nearest the inner cave entrance, watching Fitch with an expression that communicated clearly that she had not forgiven the intrusion of strangers into her space and was recording every offense for future reference. "She knocked over your shelf twice," Fitch said. "I put the stones back." "Thank you," Maribel said. She got to her feet slowly and stood with her hand on the wall while the knee made its complaint and then settled into a manageable ache. She went to the cave and checked the hens. 2 eggs, just as he'd said, which she pocketed carefully. and she checked the garden beds in the thin light from the reflector and found them undisturbed and growing in their unhurried way. And then she came back to the cabin and stood by the fire and let the warmth work on her knee. "The storm?" she said. "Still going," Caleb said from the stool. "Lighter than last night, but not done." She nodded. She had expected that. "You're going to need more wood inside," she said, not to anyone in particular, just stating the fact. "The pile out there's getting buried. We need to bring in enough to last another day without going out." "I can do that," Caleb said, and started to stand. "Your foot," she said. He looked at it. She'd wrapped it the night before, but she knew what was under the wrapping. Toes that had come close enough to frostbite that she wasn't comfortable with him putting full weight on them yet. "I can manage," he said. "Bring in half what you think you need," she said. "Then tell me how the foot feels. If it's all right, you go back for the other half." He looked at her for a moment the way people looked at her when she said practical things that they were in the process of accepting. A brief internal friction between pride and sense, and then sense won. He nodded. Fitch was still watching her. She could feel it without looking at him. "What do you need me to do?" he said. It was the strangest thing he had ever said to her. She had been in his store dozens of times, since childhood, and she could not recall him ever asking her what she needed in any tone that wasn't transactional. This was different, quiet, with the particular quality of a man who is trying, without quite knowing how, to make something right. She thought about it genuinely. "I need water heated," she said, "for Eleanor when she wakes up. And I need someone to check the pen posts outside if the snow's manageable. The third post on the north side has been loose and this storm will have pushed it further. If it goes, the pen's no good." "I can do both," he said. She nodded. He went to put water on, and she watched him move around her kitchen, her tin pots, her rough-cut shelf, the fire she had built and tended alone for 2 months. And she felt something complicated that she decided not to examine too closely because there were more urgent things to deal with. Eleanor Fitch woke up 2 hours later, and she was a different kind of difficult. Not difficult in a bad way. Difficult in the way of a person who was strong and knew it and did not like being on the receiving end of help, which was, Maribel recognized, a feeling she understood more than most. Eleanor was a small woman, probably 60, with a face that had been pretty and was now the more interesting thing that pretty faces sometimes became with age. She woke up oriented and alert, took in the room in one sharp sweep, and her second question, after "where are we?" was, "Is Aldous all right?" When she saw that he was, something in her face reorganized itself from controlled fear into controlled relief, which was only a small change on the surface but clearly represented a large one underneath. "Maribel Rowan," Eleanor said, looking at her. Not a question, she had heard Maribel say her name in the storm. "You're the girl who went to Stone Hollow." "Yes," Maribel said. "This is Stone Hollow?" "Yes." Eleanor looked around the cabin the way her husband had looked at it the night before, but where Fitch's look had been recalibrating, Eleanor's was assessing, the look of a woman who had run a household and could evaluate one. She looked at the walls, the fire, the rough shelf, the small stack of provisions, the oilcloth over the cave entrance, the neat order of necessary things. "You built all of this yourself?" Eleanor said. "Yes." "Since October?" "Yes." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. The full-face look that people so rarely gave Maribel, or rather, that people gave her and immediately looked away from. And Eleanor did not look away. "You're not what I expected," Eleanor said. "What did you expect?" "Aldous told me you'd gone up here." "Last time he came home from the store." She paused. "He said he figured you wouldn't last the month." Maribel looked at Fitch. He was at the fire with his back to them, and the back of his neck had gone red. "He said other things too," Eleanor continued, and her voice had something in it that was not quite apology, but was in that direction. "We all did, one time or another. Silver Creek talks. You know that." "I know that," Maribel said. "It's not right," Eleanor said. "Plain, no flourish. People talk without looking. We talked without looking. That's a fault, and I'm old enough to say it plainly." Maribel sat with that for a moment. It was more than most people said. It was, she thought, also true, that the cruelty she'd gotten from Silver Creek wasn't usually the active kind, the kind that took effort. It was the lazy kind, the kind that happened when people substituted the first thing they saw for the whole truth and never bothered to look further. "You're warm and you're safe," Maribel said finally. That's enough for now. Eleanor nodded once. Then she said, "Is there anything I can do?" Maribel thought about it the same way she'd thought about Fitch's question. Genuinely, practically, without the politeness of refusing help she actually needed. "Can you cook?" she said. "Better than most," Eleanor said. "Then take what I have on that shelf and make the best meal you can out of it," Maribel said. "I have flour, salt pork, 2 eggs, dried beans, and some beet greens I pulled this morning. I'll leave the how of it to you." Eleanor pushed herself up from the floor, slowly but without help, and took stock of the shelf with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been solving food problems her entire life. And within 20 minutes, there was something on the fire that smelled better than anything Maribel had eaten in 2 months. She sat against the wall with her knees stretched out and her eyes half closed and let herself rest in a way she hadn't allowed herself to rest since October, because for the first time there were other people managing things, and her body was making very clear that it needed this. The storm broke mid-afternoon on the second day. Maribel knew it before she went outside. The sound changed, the sustained roar dropping to the intermittent gusting of a storm spending itself. And when she opened the cabin door, the world was white and still, and the cold had that clean post-storm quality that felt different from the assault of the night before. The snow was deep. The woodpile was a white mound she identified by its shape rather than its surface. The hen pen was intact, though the roof section she'd built of pine branches had collapsed under the weight and would need to be rebuilt. She stood in the doorway and looked at all of it, the work the storm had done and the work it would require, and she did not feel the panic she might have felt 2 months ago. She felt tired and calculating and ready, which was not the same as fine, but was functional. Behind her, Fitch came to stand in the doorway. She heard his intake of breath when he saw the snow depth. The drifts along the cabin's north side were chest-high, had packed against the wall and partly obscured the lower logs. "That's," he started. "Deep," she said. "Yes." "How long before the road's passable?" She thought about it. "Depends on temperature. If it stays cold, the snow stays dry and a wagon can break through faster, but the horses struggle. If it warms even a few degrees, the surface ices over and then nothing moves until it melts." She paused. 2 days maybe, 3 if it stays cold." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know a lot about this." "I've been paying attention," she said. He didn't say anything to that. She could feel him behind her, and she felt the weight of all the things he was not saying, and she decided that she would let him carry that weight himself. It wasn't her job to make it lighter. "Your chimney's clear," she said. "Caleb cleared it this morning. The pen roof needs rebuilding, but the animals are all right. The path down will need to be broken on the way out. I'll do the first section, but I'll need someone to work ahead of Eleanor on the steep part." "I'll do it," he said. "My legs are fine." "Good." She went out into the snow. Those next 2 days had a quality she wouldn't have predicted. The 4 of them, 5, counting Ruth, who had decided she was an indoor sheep now and was not interested in returning to the pen until Maribel physically escorted her, existed in the close space of the cabin with a kind of forced honesty that being thrown together by a storm produced in people. They talked, which was inevitable. They talked about Silver Creek, about the storm, about the wagon that Fitch said was beyond saving. The axle had snapped when it went over. They talked about the animals, about the beets that Eleanor went and inspected in the cave with an expression of such genuine astonishment that Maribel felt something warm move through her that she hadn't expected. "Underground vegetables," Eleanor said, standing in the cave with the lantern, looking at the beds. "In December." "The spring keeps the temperature up," Maribel said. "Just enough." "And this mirror," Eleanor touched the edge of the tin reflector. "It bounces the light in," Maribel said. "Not enough in deep winter, but enough to keep them alive." Eleanor straightened up and looked at her in the same way she'd looked at her the first morning, the full-face look. "How did you know to do this?" "I didn't," Maribel said. "I thought it might work. I wasn't certain. But you did it anyway." "I didn't have other options," Maribel said, which was the honest answer rather than the impressive one. Eleanor considered this. "Most people, when they don't have other options, stop," she said. "They accept that things can't be done. They find someone to agree with them that it can't be done, and then they feel better about not doing it." Maribel looked at her. "You didn't do that," Eleanor said. "No," Maribel said. "I didn't." They stood in the cave for a moment, the spring dripping steadily behind them, the thin winter light catching the tin reflector and throwing its pale rectangle across the beet leaves. "What else do you need here?" Eleanor said, and the way she said it, practical, direct, without preamble, made it clear she wasn't making small talk. She was asking a real question, and she expected a real answer. Maribel had not been asked what she needed by anyone in so long that for a moment she didn't know how to receive the question. She stood there and actually thought about it. "Seed," she said finally, "more variety than I have. I have turnip, carrot, beet. I need beans that'll climb. Pole beans, if anyone has them. Squash if possible, it stores well. And I could use another laying hen." She paused. "And a ram, come spring. Ruth needs to lamb if she's going to be worth keeping, and I can't afford to buy a ram." Eleanor nodded slowly, cataloging. "What do you have to trade?" she said. "Vegetables in spring, pine posts, I've been cutting them, and—" She hesitated because the next thing felt larger than the others. "I've been thinking about the cave, the temperature. There's enough space and enough consistent cold in the deep back section, colder than the spring section, that it could function as a larder in summer. Keep meat without smoking it, keep produce without curing. If I could get a door installed at the back passage, insulate it properly." She stopped. "That would be valuable to more than just me." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "You're talking about a shared cold storage." "I'm talking about a possibility," Maribel said. "I don't know what it would take yet. I'd need to understand what people actually needed stored and how much. But the cave is here and it maintains temperature on its own. I didn't build that. It was already doing it." "Aldous knows everyone in town," Eleanor said. "What they need, what they have, what they'd trade for." "I know," Maribel said. She did not say, "Aldous Fitch told his shelf boy I'd be dead by Christmas." She did not say it because it was true, and it had hurt, and holding it up between herself and Eleanor right now would not change what the cave could do. "I'll talk to him," Eleanor said. They went back into the cabin. But that evening, Fitch asked to see the cave himself. She took him in with the lantern. He was quiet, in the way of a man who was genuinely trying to understand something rather than looking for confirmation of what he already thought. And she gave him time to look and didn't explain everything immediately, because in her experience, people understood things better when they were allowed to arrive at them on their own rather than being told. He looked at the beds. He looked at the spring. He crouched at the back passage, a lower, narrower section that went another 15 feet into the rock, colder and drier than the main cave, and held the lantern through the entrance and looked at the walls. "It's like an ice house," he said, "but it doesn't need ice." "In summer, the temperature back there stays around 40 degrees, she said. "I haven't been here in summer, but that's my estimate based on the winter temperature and the drop toward the back. The rock insulates." He stood up. He turned and looked at the garden beds again, then at the reflector, then at the spring. "Eleanor said you'd need seed in spring," he said. "Yes. I can get pole bean seed. I carry it in the store. You'll have seen it." He paused. "I'll bring it next time someone comes up." "What do you want for it?" He looked at her directly. "Nothing," he said. She held his gaze. "I don't take charity, Aldous." "It's not charity," he said. He said it firmly, almost irritably, as if she was being unreasonable. Call it an investment. If what you're saying about the cave is right, and I think you're right, then what you're building here is worth more to this community than a packet of bean seed." He stopped. "And I talked to my shelf boy while you were asleep last night." She waited. "I told him what I said in the store was wrong," he said, "and that he was to keep his opinions about women he knew nothing about to himself." It was not an enormous gesture. She knew that. Talking to a shelf boy about something he'd already laughed at months ago was not a grand act of restitution. But it was real. It was a thing he'd actually done rather than simply felt bad about, and she had found, over the course of her life, that the distance between feeling bad and doing something about it was where most people lived permanently. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. He nodded once and looked away, back at the cave, at the beds, at the spring. And she could see him still processing the gap between what he'd thought she was and what she actually was. And she understood that gap would take him a long time to fully cross. That was all right. She wasn't waiting for him to cross it. She had her own things to do. They left on the morning of the third day, when the temperature had come up 2 degrees and the path was manageable. Maribel broke the first section herself, stamping down the snow ahead of Eleanor, while Fitch worked the steep part. Caleb went last, his foot wrapped in an extra layer of cloth she'd cut from the hem of her second blanket, and she'd made him a rough walking staff from a straight pine branch and told him to keep his weight off the right side on the downhill sections. At the point where the path turned and Silver Creek came into view below, the collection of rooftops she'd looked at from the cliff ledge, the smoke columns thin in the cold air, they all stopped. She didn't know why. It just happened, all 4 of them stopping at the same point, looking down at the town they were returning to and the hill they were leaving. She stayed a step behind them, and she looked at the hollow behind her, the cabin against the cliff, the smoke from her chimney, the snow-covered pen, the woodpile mound, the whole rough and functional reality of what she'd built. And she felt it then, fully, for the first time. The size of it. Not pride exactly, because pride felt too comfortable and she was not comfortable. She was still tired and her knee still hurt, and there was a lot of work between here and anything she could call settled. But something like, this is real. This is a thing that exists. I made it out of nothing, and it held 4 people through a blizzard, and they are all alive. That was real. That was the size of what was real. Eleanor turned first. She looked at Maribel with her full-face look, and she said, "You'll have visitors in spring." "I expect so," Maribel said. "Not the rude kind," Eleanor said. "The useful kind." "I'll manage either kind," Maribel said. Eleanor almost smiled. It was the almost kind, the kind that lived in the eyes and the corners of the mouth without fully committing, and it was the most genuine expression she'd shown since she woke up. She turned and started down the path. Fitch was last. He stood at the bend and looked at her, really looked. And she could see him building toward something, the way he'd been building toward it for 2 days. And she waited to see whether it would come out or whether he'd swallow it the way he'd swallowed things his whole life. "I told my wife last night," he said, "while you were sleeping." He stopped. "What I'd said in the store about you." She waited. She was not, he paused, choosing his word, pleased. "I'd imagine not," Maribel said. "She's a more honest person than I am," he said. "She told me that what I said was the kind of thing that small people say about large people because it makes them feel bigger." He stopped. She was right. Maribel looked at him. "I've been in business in Silver Creek for 22 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of people try things and fail. I got into the habit of predicting failure. It was—" Another pause, another careful word. "It was easier than being wrong." "I know," she said. Because she did know. She understood the logic of it, even though it had been aimed at her like a weapon. "I was wrong," he said, flat, simple, the same quality Caleb's apology had had. Not flowery, not elaborate, just the thing itself dropped on the table between them. She looked at him for a long moment. At his face, which was cold and tired and marked by the cut on his cheekbone, and the look of a man who was trying to be honest about something that honesty about wasn't comfortable. "You were wrong," she said, "and now you know it." He nodded. "Come spring," she said, "I'll need help getting a door installed on the back passage of the cave. I can do most of it, but I'll need another set of hands for the frame." He blinked. Yes, I can come." "Bring the bean seed when you come," she said. Something moved in his face that she thought might, in a different man or a different moment, have been close to relief. He nodded again, and then he turned and followed his wife down the path. She watched them go until the scrub closed around them. Then she turned around and looked at the hollow. Ruth was at the cabin door. She had opened it. The leather hinge, Maribel noted, was going to need replacing, and was standing with her front feet inside the cabin and her back feet out, looking at Maribel with the expression of an animal who had decided that outdoors was a historical concept. "Ruth," Maribel said. The sheep didn't move. "You are a sheep," Maribel said. "You live outside." Ruth's jaw moved. She walked back up to the cabin and guided Ruth into the pen and latched the gate, checked the north post, which was indeed loose, and hammered it back with the flat head of the axe. And then she stood in the middle of the hollow in the snow and the cold and the post-storm stillness, and she looked at everything around her and let herself feel the size of what the last 3 days had been. Her body was exhausted in ways she hadn't had time to feel while there were other people to manage. Her knee throbbed steadily. Her left shoulder, when she moved it in a circle, produced a grinding sensation that she filed under deal with later. Her hands, which had been cold and wet for 36 hours through the worst of the storm, were stiff in all the joints, and the oldest blisters had reopened under the repeated soaking. She stood in all of that and let it be what it was. She had gone out into a blizzard, alone, with a lantern and a rope and a body that everyone in Silver Creek had spent years deciding wasn't capable of significant things. She had found two people in the dark and the cold, and she had carried one of them and led the other and gotten all of them up the hill to the shelter she had built from nothing, and the shelter had held. It had held because she had built it right. Not perfectly. There were gaps that needed repacking, and a hinge that needed replacing, and a pen roof that needed rebuilding. But right in the way that mattered, structurally, functionally, for real conditions rather than ideal ones. She was not sure what to do with all of that. She was not sure what the shape of it was yet. She went inside. She fed the animals. She ate the last of Eleanor's beet green and salt pork bread cold from the pot, and it was the best thing she had tasted in 2 months, and she sat on the floor by the fire and ate it slowly and looked at the walls of the cabin she had built, and the cave entrance behind the oilcloth, and the scratched record on the limestone wall and the rough shelf with its depleted provisions. And she thought about spring, about seed and lambs and a door on the back passage, about Eleanor saying the useful kind, about Caleb Morrow's plain two-word apology and Fitch's longer, harder, more expensive one, about the young assessor standing at the bottom of the path and looking up at the hollow with that expression she hadn't known what to do with, the one that wasn't pity or cruelty, but something it had taken her a while to name. She named it now, sitting by her fire in the cabin she had built alone. It was surprise. Plain human surprise. The surprise of a person who expected nothing and found something instead. She thought she could work with that. She put another piece of wood on the fire and lay down on the blanket and pulled her coat over her and listened to the wind moving through the trees outside. Lighter now, spent, just weather again rather than the thing it had been 2 nights ago, and she let her eyes close. On the wall beside the door, the scratched record of her days ran in its irregular line. Each mark a morning she had woken up and moved and done something and made it to the evening. She would add tomorrow's mark in the morning, and the one after that, and however many came after that for as long as she was here, which was, she had decided sometime in the last 3 days without formally deciding it, going to be a long time. January was the month that tried to finish what December had started. The blizzard had broken, yes, and the Fitches and Caleb Morrow had gone back down the mountain with their story, but the winter itself had no interest in being over. It came back at Maribel in smaller, more personal ways. A cold that settled into her knee and stayed there. A week of freezing rain that was worse than snow because it coated everything in a layer of ice that made every surface treacherous and turned the path to the woodpile into something she had to navigate on all fours. A morning when she woke to find the smoke channel blocked by ice and the cabin filled with a thin haze that sent her outside coughing in the pre-dawn dark to clear it with a stick, barefoot on the ice because she hadn't stopped to put her boots on, and then regretted it for the rest of the day. The knee was the most persistent problem. She had hurt it on the way back from the wagon. She was fairly sure now that she'd twisted something in the fall when Eleanor had lurched against her, and it had gone from a manageable ache to something more specific and demanding as the cold settled into it. She wrapped it each morning with a strip of cloth torn from the shirt she'd outgrown in November. Her body was changing in ways she was still getting used to, not smaller exactly, but differently arranged, harder in some places, more capable in the way that bodies became capable when they were used honestly and fed honestly and asked to do real work every day. The knee wrap helped. Moving helped more than resting, which was counterintuitive but true, and she had learned to trust what was true over what seemed like it should be true. She kept working. There was no alternative to working, but she had also discovered something in the weeks since the storm that she hadn't expected. She wanted to. Not in a performed, isn't this wonderful way. In the plain, specific way that came from caring about what you were building and wanting to see it become more of what it could be. The garden beds needed tending. The pen roof needed rebuilding. The back passage door that she'd discussed with Fitch would need preparation before he arrived. The frame would need to be measured, the hinges figured out, the insulation planned. These were not burdens. They were problems with solutions, which was, she had come to understand, her natural habitat. Ruth had accepted outdoor life again after 3 days of negotiations that Maribel had conducted with the patience of a diplomat and the firmness of someone who genuinely could not afford to heat a sheep's portion of cabin. The hens were laying reliably, 2 eggs a day, sometimes 3 from the larger one, who had apparently decided to overachieve. Maribel had started rationing eggs more carefully, one for herself each morning, the rest held in the cold back passage to accumulate against the days when there'd be nothing else. She ate small. Not from despair, from calculation. The flour was down to 1/3 of the original amount. The salt pork was nearly gone. The dried beans she had left she was saving to plant in spring rather than eat now, which meant they were no longer food, they were seed. And the line between those two things was one she had to hold clearly in her mind or she'd eat them in a hungry moment and regret it for 6 months. The beets had matured. This was the fact that saved February from being genuinely dangerous. She pulled the first 4 in late January, and they were not large, not the generous palm-sized beets of a summer garden, but they were dense and sweet in the way that slow-grown things sometimes were, and she boiled them in the cooking pot and ate them with salt and a little of the remaining flour made into flat bread on the hot stone, and it was the most complete she had felt since Eleanor's bread after the storm. She replanted that section of the bed immediately, pushing new seeds into the soil the same evening, because empty beds were lost time, and she could not afford lost time. The turnips came in waves. She staggered the harvesting, pulling only what she needed and letting the rest keep growing. And the carrots, the slowest of the 3, were finally thickening at the shoulder, not yet ready but getting there. She talked to them less than she had in November. Not because she'd stopped. She still did, in an absent-minded way, the running commentary of someone who'd been alone long enough that the distinction between thinking and speaking had blurred, but because the urgency had gone out of it. In November, she'd been talking to them the way you talk to something you weren't sure would make it. Now she talked to them the way you talk to something that had. The first visitor arrived in February. She heard him before she saw him, the crunch of boots on the ice-crusted path, careful and deliberate, someone who'd done the climb before. She came out of the cabin with the axe in her hand, not raised, just held, because she had been alone long enough that unexpected footsteps required a reasonable response. It was Caleb Morrow. He looked better than he had the night of the storm, color in his face, moving without a limp, though she noticed he placed his right foot with slight extra care on the uneven ground. He was carrying a pack that rode high and heavy on his shoulders, and he stopped when he saw the axe and held up both hands in the gesture of a man who was familiar with that kind of greeting. "Just me," he said. "I can see that," she said. She lowered the axe but didn't put it down. "Come in." He came in. He set the pack on the floor and opened it, and she looked at what was inside and felt something move in her chest that she didn't immediately identify. Food. Real food. A wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a smoked ham hock, 2 pounds of dried corn, a jar of preserved apples, a packet of coffee that she had not had since before October and had missed with a specific, unreasonable intensity. She looked at it and then looked at him. "Eleanor sent most of it," he said quickly, reading her expression. It's not charity. She said to tell you she's calling it the first installment on consulting fees." "Consulting fees," Maribel said. Her words. "What does she want consulting on?" "She's been talking to people in town," Caleb said. "About the cave. About what you told her, the cold storage, the temperature. She talked to the butcher first. Then the miller." He paused. "Then pretty much everyone else." Maribel sat down on the stool slowly. "How many people?" "Enough that Fitch is building a list," Caleb said. "He wanted me to bring it up, but I told him I'd come first and make sure that things were—" He stopped. "That I was still alive," she said. "Yes," he said, without dressing it up. "I'm still alive," she said. "I can see that," he said, and there was something in it, a dryness, a recognition, that was different from the way he'd spoken to her in the storm, when everything had been crisis and urgency. This was 2 people talking plainly, which was, she thought, a thing she hadn't had in a long time. She made coffee. It took longer than it should have because her hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the smell of it. The specific smell of coffee brewing that she had apparently been missing more deeply than she'd known. She gave Caleb a cup and kept one for herself, and they sat, her on the stool and him on the flat stone she'd been using as a second seat since the storm, and they drank it. How's the foot? She said. Fine, he said. Lost the tip of the small toe. She looked at him. Frost got it fully, he said, matter-of-factly. Doc took it off clean. Doesn't affect walking. He shrugged. The shrug of a man who had calculated a loss and accepted the arithmetic. Could have been worse. It could have, she said. They sat with that for a moment. What did you say? She asked then. In Fitch's store last spring. He looked at his cup. You want me to say it? I want to know what it was, she said. Not to punish you. I just like knowing the actual thing rather than imagining it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I said that sending a fat girl to Stone Hollow was the most creative way to get rid of someone I'd ever heard of. He paused. And that you'd probably eat yourself to death before the cold got you. She looked at him steadily. It was ugly, he said. I knew it was ugly when I said it. I said it anyway because there were other men in the store and saying ugly things made them laugh, and I wanted them to laugh. Another pause. I've thought about that a lot since the storm. Why I said it, what it cost, and who it cost. Me, she said. You, he said. And he stopped. And the part of me that could have been better and wasn't. She drank her coffee. It was extraordinary, the coffee, and she let herself be present for it, the taste of it, the warmth, the smell, while she sat with what he'd said. You came up here in February with a heavy pack over a path that's half ice, she said. I think that says something. It doesn't undo what I said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But it's not nothing either. He looked at her, and she thought she saw him decide something, some internal settlement, the kind that came when a person accepted that they were being given something they hadn't earned, and that the giving was still genuine. Eleanor said to tell you she'll come herself in March when the path is better, he said. And Fitch is coming with the bean seed and some wood planks for the door. He said... Caleb paused, as if checking his memory. He said to tell you he found a ram, a neighbor's, 2 valleys over, young, healthy. He can bring it in spring if you want it. Maribel set down her cup. A ram. Ruth could lamb by summer. And lambs meant wool and meat and the beginning of something that could actually sustain itself, that could grow rather than just maintain. Tell him yes, she said. March came in with mud. The snow melted in uneven patches, and the mud underneath was the deep, sucking kind that pulled at boots and made every trip on the path twice as long and half again as exhausting. But the mud meant warmth, and warmth meant spring, and spring meant the list of things she'd been holding in her head through the winter could begin converting from plans to actions. She spent March rebuilding. The hen pen roof went up properly this time. Not pine branches, but split planks, the ones she'd had left over from the cabin walls, overlapped and angled so water would run off rather than pooling. The pen for Ruth she extended by 6 feet on the east side, because a pregnant sheep needed more room than a non-pregnant sheep, and she was operating on the optimistic assumption that the ram would arrive and do his job. The cave beds she expanded, cleared 2 additional sections of the cave floor, built new stone frames, and began the long work of hauling soil again, because the consulting fees Eleanor had sent included, alongside the food, a pound of squash seed and 2 packets of climbing bean seed that Maribel held in her palms and looked at for a long time before she put them carefully away. Fitch came on the 15th of March. He came with his shelf boy, a young man named Peter, who turned out to be quieter and more capable than his store behavior had suggested, and they carried between them the wood planks for the door, a paper bag of bean seed, 3 pounds of nails, and Eleanor's second installment of consulting fees, which was a wool blanket and a jar of rendered fat that Maribel did not cry about and would not admit to almost crying about. They installed the door to the back passage in a day and a half. It was not elegant. The frame sat slightly off square because the cave opening wasn't square, and the door itself was 3 planks wide with a leather pull and a wooden latch. But when she closed it and stood on the warm side and felt the temperature differential, she felt the specific satisfaction of a thing that worked doing the thing it was supposed to do. Fitch stood beside her, and they both stood in front of the closed door in the main cave section, in the temperature difference between the spring-warmed side and the cold storage side that was now properly contained, and she watched him feel it. 40 degrees back there, she said. Maybe 42. It'll be colder in deep summer when the outside temperature pushes down through the rock in reverse, but not by much. He was quiet for a moment. She could almost hear him calculating. The butcher's needs, the miller's, the households in town trying to keep food through the summer heat. If someone brought a load of fresh meat up here in June, he said slowly, how long would it keep? 2 weeks at least, she said. Maybe 3. Longer if it's salted first. He looked at her. And you'd charge for the storage. I'd charge for the storage, she confirmed. What do you want for it? She had thought about this through the whole of February and most of March. She had thought about it carefully and without sentiment, because sentiment was the thing that made people give away what they needed to keep, and she had learned enough about survival to know the difference between generosity and self-destruction. I want trade, she said, not money, or not only money. I want seed in the varieties I don't have. I want labor. People come up and help with heavy work twice a year, spring and fall. I want first right to any livestock someone's selling before it goes to general market. She paused. And I want it in writing, an agreement with the town, not just with individuals. Fitch looked at her for a long time. You've been thinking about this a while, he said. Since November, she said. Eleanor said you were smart, he said. I told her everyone said you were quiet. Being quiet and being smart aren't the same thing, she said, but they're easy to confuse if you're not paying attention. He made a sound that might, from a man with more practice at it, have been a laugh. From Fitch, it was more like the sound a man made when he was caught being wrong and had the self-awareness to know it. I'll draw up an agreement, he said. Bring it next week for you to look at. I'll read every word of it, she said. I expect you will, he said. And this time the thing in his voice was not condescension. It was something closer to respect, plain and without ceremony, the kind that came from watching someone do what they said they'd do and do it well. The ram arrived in April. His name, according to the neighbor who'd sent him with Fitch, was something she couldn't pronounce and immediately changed to Henry, because he had the energy of a Henry, purposeful, slightly self-important, convinced of his own significance. He and Ruth regarded each other through the pen gate for approximately 3 minutes before Ruth made her decision, which was apparently favorable, and that was that. Maribel stood at the pen gate and watched this and felt a complicated mix of relief and embarrassment that she was standing in a field on a mountain, feeling relieved about a sheep's romantic life. But the lambs would come in the fall if the timing worked, and the lambs mattered, and the things that mattered were the things you paid attention to, no matter how they looked. Spring came on fast after that, the way it did in the hill country, tentative for weeks and then suddenly everywhere, the scrub greening up, the ground softening and then drying and then warming, the air losing that bone-deep chill that she had lived inside for 5 months. She put the climbing beans in first, in the outside beds she'd built along the south-facing base of the cliff. 4 feet of full sun for most of the day, good drainage, the cliff's warmth radiating back at night to protect against late frosts. The squash went in a section she'd cleared and built up with compost she'd been accumulating in a corner of the cave over the winter, kitchen scraps and ash and dead plant material, and Ruth's contribution to the process, which Ruth had made generously and continuously. The cave bed she continued with beets and carrots and turnips, the cool season crops that the cave did best with. The underground garden that had kept her alive through January was now a fully functioning growing system with 4 sections, 2 of them producing and 2 in rotation, and she had scratched a map of it on the limestone wall next to her day count. Which section was planted, when, what variety, when it was due to be ready. She stood in front of the wall one morning in late April and looked at the whole record, the day count with its irregular marks, the garden map, the little notations she'd made through the winter. And she counted back to October, to the morning she'd walked out her father's door and stood in the cold with $17 and a worthless deed. 7 months. She was not the same person who had stood there. She didn't mean this in a sentimental way. She meant it literally, specifically. She had calluses where she hadn't had them. She had muscle in her arms and back that had built slowly and without ceremony from months of actual use. Her knee had healed, mostly, with a small residual tightness in cold weather that she accepted as permanent and managed accordingly. She moved differently, not gracefully. She had never been graceful, and wasn't now, but with the particular ease of a person who knew exactly what her body could do because she had tested it comprehensively against real conditions. She was still large. She wanted to be clear about this in her own mind. She had not transformed into something different in the way that stories sometimes transform their people, as if suffering were a sculpting tool and hardship produced beauty as its natural byproduct. She was still exactly herself, in the same body, with the same face that Silver Creek had been looking at for 18 years and deciding things about. The wilderness had not cared about any of that. The cave had not cared. The spring hadn't. The soil she'd hauled up the hill one pot at a time hadn't cared what she looked like doing it. Only people cared about that, and she had spent 7 months in a place where the only people were the ones she'd chosen to deal with. That had taught her something she was still working out the edges of. Eleanor came up in early May with 2 women from town that Maribel didn't know well. One was the butcher's wife, a compact woman named Ada, with flour on her sleeve and opinions about everything that she delivered at a speed that took getting used to. The other was younger, maybe Maribel's age, maybe a year older, named Dora. Quiet in a different way than Maribel was quiet. The kind of quiet that came from watching carefully rather than from not having anything to say. They came ostensibly to look at the cold storage. They all looked at the cold storage, and Ada made calculations out loud at a pace that was genuinely impressive, and Eleanor inspected the garden beds with the same assessing eye she'd brought in December, and Dora stood at the cave entrance and looked at the whole setup, the layout, the reflector, the spring channel Maribel had improved in March by lining it with flat stones to direct the flow, with an expression that Maribel recognized because she'd made it herself in October. The expression of someone seeing something and knowing immediately that it mattered. "What are you doing there?" Dora asked, meaning the back section, the cold storage. "Nothing yet," Maribel said. "It'll start being used in summer." "Could you grow things in there too? The cold kind?" Maribel looked at her. "What do you mean?" "We have a root cellar at home," Dora said. "In winter I can keep carrots and parsnips in it for months. The cold slows them down. They don't rot the way they do in a warmer space." She paused. "If your back section stays at 40 degrees all summer, could you keep root vegetables there through the summer heat? When everything in town either has to be eaten fast or it goes bad." Maribel stood very still. She had been thinking about the cave as 2 things, a warm growing space and a cold storage space. She had not been thinking about it as a 3rd thing, a preservation space specifically for the summer harvested roots that otherwise couldn't be kept in hill country heat, a way to have October's carrots available in July. "Yes," she said slowly, "if they were packed right. Dry sand, maybe. I'd need to figure out the packing." "My grandmother used sand," Dora said. "Where are you from?" Maribel asked. "Pennsylvania originally," Dora said, "before my family came west." "What does your family do?" "My father's a carpenter," Dora said. "My brother too." Maribel looked at her. Then she looked at the door to the back passage, the one that was slightly off square, that worked but didn't seal perfectly along the top edge. "Does your brother do work for trade?" she said. Dora almost smiled. "I think he might." Eleanor, who had been listening to all of this from the garden beds with the expression of a woman watching something she'd hoped would happen, said nothing. But Maribel caught the look she exchanged with Ada, and Ada caught Maribel catching it, and Ada had the honesty to look slightly caught. "You were all expecting this," Maribel said. "Eleanor said you'd be useful to know," Ada said, without apologizing for it. She was right. "She could also just say hello," Maribel said. Ada looked at her for a moment, then she actually laughed, a real one, the quick, sharp kind, and said, "Fair enough. Hello." "Hello," Maribel said. And something shifted right there in the cave, in that small exchange. Something that wasn't a dramatic shift, wasn't a speech or a moment of transformation, but was the kind of small, ordinary shift that turned out later to be the one that mattered. The shift from being a subject, a person that Silver Creek had opinions about, to being a neighbor. Someone with a name and a capability and something to offer that stood separate from what she looked like. It was small, but she had learned, over 7 months, that small things done consistently were the only way anything real ever got built. Summer arrived, and with it, everything at once. The climbing beans went up their poles with a speed that startled her after the grinding patience of the winter crops, and the squash spread across the south bed in wide, flat leaves and sent out its yellow flowers, and the cave continued growing its quiet underground harvest, and the back passage began its first season of actual use when the butcher sent up 2 wrapped haunches of beef in June that kept for 18 days in the cold dark of the rock, which was 3 days longer than his most optimistic estimate, and which resulted in a note that arrived with Ada on her next visit that contained both a payment and what was clearly the most effusive language the butcher had ever committed to paper. Maribel read the note twice and then used it to start the fire. She did not mean this unkindly. She just had limited paper, and the sentiment was recorded in her own memory, and that was sufficient. The agreement Fitch had drawn up, and she had indeed read every word of it, had sent back 2 revisions with specific language changes that he'd accepted without argument, which itself told her something about how the dynamic between them had settled, was signed in June by Fitch as community representative, witnessed by Eleanor and the county assessor's young man, Clement Ward, who had come back up the path voluntarily to see the place again and had spent an hour in the cave asking questions that suggested he'd been thinking about the cold storage problem himself for months. The agreement gave her what she'd asked for: trade in seed and labor and first right on livestock. It gave the town access to the cold storage at rates she'd set. It gave both parties the right to renegotiate annually. It was not a perfect document. There were things in it she'd wanted and hadn't gotten. A clearer definition of what counted as labor, a firmer commitment on the seed varieties. She had decided these were fights for the second year's negotiation rather than the first. You built trust the same way you built walls, one thing at a time, checking the level as you went. Ruth lambed in September. 2 lambs, both healthy, which was more than Maribel had let herself hope for, because hoping specifically had always felt like tempting the outcome to go the other way. She had paced outside the pen for 4 hours during the labor, which was undignified and probably useless, and she did it anyway. And when both lambs were on their feet and nursing, she sat down in the mud of the pen entrance and put her back against the post and stayed there for a while. The lambs were small and ridiculous and magnificent, and they tottered around the pen with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of things that had been alive for approximately 2 hours and were very committed to the project. Ruth supervised them with the attentive patience of an animal who had developed over the past year into something considerably more than the battered-eared UA Gus Pallister had sold to a large girl with blistered hands and $4.20. Maribel named the lambs. She named them the way she'd named Ruth, practically, after qualities she could already see. The bigger one, who pushed ahead of her sibling at every opportunity, she named Ada, for the butcher's wife, whose opinions arrived before she did. The smaller one, who watched everything first and then decided, she named Dora. She did not tell either of the actual women. Some things were private. Dora's brother came in late September to fix the door. His name was Martin, and he was a solid, efficient man in his mid-20s who looked at the off-square door frame with the particular expression of a craftsman encountering a problem that offended him personally. He spent the first 10 minutes not saying much, just examining the frame from every angle, and then he turned to Maribel and said, "The rock moved." "What?" "The cave opening. The limestone on the left side has a small fault line in it." He showed her with his fingers where the rock had settled slightly, pushing the left side of the opening out of true. "It happened slowly. The door frame followed it. That's why the seal at the top is off." He paused. "I can reframe it to match the actual opening rather than the ideal square. It'll look odd, but it'll seal right." "Do that," she said. He did. It took him a day and a half, and he was fussier about it than she expected, measuring 3 times, planning the edge of one plank twice before he was satisfied. And the result, when he hung the reframed door and she closed it, sealed along every edge so completely that the temperature differential was immediate and unmistakable. She stood on the warm side and felt it and said, "What do you want for this?" He named a price in vegetables that was, she thought, lower than the work was worth. She added 20 pounds of winter squash to it, and he accepted without argument and loaded his handcart and went back down the path. And she watched him go and thought about the practical efficiency of people who did their work well and charged fairly for it and didn't make speeches about it. That was, she thought, a kind of integrity, quiet and functional, the kind that didn't require an audience. October came back around. She marked it on the wall, not with the scratch of the daily count, which she'd stopped keeping in March, when the days had started containing too much to reduce to a single mark, but with something more deliberate. She took the nail and scratched a single line beside the first mark she'd made, the very first one, the morning after she'd arrived. 1 year. Or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. She stood back and looked at the whole wall, the record of the first winter, the garden map, the notations and revisions and additions she'd made through the year, and she thought about what it was. Not a success story, not a triumph in the way that word usually got used, with its implication of something concluded, wrapped up, resolved. This was not resolved. The knee would tighten every winter. The smoke channel would need repacking every fall. The cave beds would need more soil eventually, as the plants took what was there. The agreement with the town would need renegotiation in spring. Ruth would need to lamb again. The climbing beans had produced abundantly this year and would need new poles next year because the old ones had gone soft at the base from a summer of wet weather. There was no moment at which it would be done. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood when she'd walked out her father's door with $17 and a worthless deed. She had been waiting, underneath everything, for the moment when she would have built enough that she could stop building. When the work would convert to something stable and self-sustaining and finished. That moment didn't come. What came instead was something she valued more. The work became hers. Fully, irrevocably hers. Not a struggle against insufficiency, but an ongoing relationship with a living thing she'd built. That changed and grew and demanded things, and gave things back, and that relationship was what the rest of her life was going to be made of. She could live with that. She had been living with it for a year, and she had found, underneath the exhaustion and the knee pain and the mornings when nothing went right and the days when she didn't see another person and the nights when the loneliness was a specific located ache in the center of her chest, underneath all of that, she had found that she was genuinely, functionally, unsentimental okay. Not happy in the simple, clean way of someone who had gotten what they wanted. Happy in the harder, more durable way of someone who had made something real. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, she climbed the ladder to the cliff ledge. She hadn't been up since she'd first climbed it the previous autumn. There had always been something more pressing, something that needed doing before she could justify taking 30 minutes to stand on a ledge and look at a view. But the afternoon was clear, and the work was caught up as much as work ever was, and she climbed. At the top, she looked south. Silver Creek was still small from here, still a collection of rooftops and smoke columns in the valley. But she could see things now she hadn't been able to see the first time, or she could see the same things and understand them differently. The store roof that was Fitch's, the smoke from the butcher's yard, the road that ran south out of town, and the road north that wound up toward the hill country, toward the path that was now worn visibly into the scrub because enough people had used it enough times that the land had accepted it as a permanent feature. Her path. That had not existed a year ago. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about her father, who had called it not personal. She thought about her mother's back. She thought about the shelf boy's laugh and Fitch's recalibration and Eleanor's full-face look and Caleb's two-word apology and Dora standing at the cave entrance with the expression of someone seeing something that mattered. She thought about the young assessor's confusion, the thing it had taken her months to name, and she thought about what it meant that the thing she'd built had produced that confusion in people who had expected nothing. She was not sure, even now, that she had forgiven her father. She was not sure forgiveness was the right frame for it. Too clean, too final, too much like closing a door on something that was still breathing. What she felt instead was more complicated and more honest. She understood what he had done and why, and she understood that understanding it didn't make it right, and she understood that she had been shaped by it in ways she was still discovering, and that some of those ways had made her better at the specific work of her specific life. She was not grateful for the cruelty, but she was no longer only defined by having been its target. That was not the same as forgiving, but it was a place she could stand. The wind came up from the south and moved her hair and carried with it the smell of the valley, wood smoke and earth and the faint animal smell of town, and she breathed it in and let it pass. Below her, in the hollow, Ruth was at the pen gate, watching the lambs with the focused attention of a mother who had not yet decided whether the world was trustworthy. The hens were in their raised pen, making their periodic announcements. The cave entrance was dark and ordinary from above, showing nothing of what it held inside. The growing beds, the spring, the cold passage, the whole unlikely system she had built one pot of soil and one cracked pine log at a time. She had come here with nothing, and she had made something, not a perfect something, something with a slightly off-square door and a chimney that needed seasonal maintenance, and a sheep who still believed she was a housemate rather than livestock. Something that had failed in small ways repeatedly, and been fixed, and had failed again, and been fixed again. Because that was what real things did. They failed in specific ways, and got fixed in specific ways and became stronger at the fixed places, not in spite of the failure, but because of it. She had not known, when she walked out her father's door, that she was capable of this. She had not known because no one had ever created the conditions in which she could find out, and so she had never found out. And the not knowing had been its own kind of weight, heavier, in some ways, than the work itself. The not knowing what you were capable of was a prison with no visible walls, and you couldn't escape it by thinking about it. You could only escape it by doing the thing and finding out from the doing. She had done the thing. She climbed back down. Her left knee spoke on the descent, the familiar tightness, and she moved through it carefully and reached the ground and stood for a moment with her hand on the cliff face, the rock warm from the afternoon sun, solid in the way that rock was solid, indifferent in the way that the wilderness was indifferent, asking nothing and giving what it gave without caring who received it. She took her hand off the rock and walked back to the cabin. Ruth was at the pen gate. The lambs were pressed against her sides, small and sturdy and alive. The hens had gone quiet in their pen, settling for the evening. From inside the cave she could hear the spring, the small constant sound she had fallen asleep to for a year, the sound she no longer noticed until she stopped and listened for it. And then it was there, always, unchanged. She looked at all of it, the pen she had built, and the lambs that had been born in it, and the cave she had not built but had found and made use of, and the cabin she had built wrong first and corrected and built again, and the path that now existed because enough people had walked it. The door with its reframed square that sealed fully now. The wall with its record of days. She had spent her whole life being looked at and found wanting. She had spent a year being looked at by something that didn't have opinions about her, or a mountain, a cave, a piece of land that everyone else had called worthless. And in that year she had found out what she was worth, not by being told, but by finding out. The only way you ever really found out. She went inside. She built the fire up. She put water on for the beets she'd pulled that afternoon, and she sat on the stool and looked at the fire. And she was tired in the good way, and the day was ending, and tomorrow there would be more work, and she would do it, and the day after that, and after that. Outside, the last light left the sky in the quiet way it did in autumn. Not dramatically, not with color, just a gradual dimming until the stars came out, one at a time, over the hollow she had made her own. The spring dripped in the dark. The lambs slept. The fire held. She was home.